A little black boy ran into a group of bikers crying for help. His mother had just been taken. What happened next will remind you that heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they ride Harleys. Stay tuned till the end for this unbelievable, true-hearted story. The heat of the afternoon clung to the air like a heavy blanket, the sky painted in shades of orange and gold. A line of motorcycles gleamed under the sun outside a small roadside diner, their engines quiet for once. Inside, a group of rugged bikers laughed loudly, the sound echoing through the dusty lot. They looked like men no one wanted to mess with. Thick leather jackets, weathered faces, tattoos that told stories of wild roads and broken rules. But their laughter suddenly died when a small figure appeared from the road, running toward them as if chased by ghosts. It was a little black boy, no older than 8 or 9, barefoot and covered in dust. His face was streaked with tears, his small chest heaving as he screamed, "Please! They took my mom! They took her!" For a second, no one moved. The sound of his trembling voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. One of the bikers set down his drink, exchanging a wary glance with the others. Their world didn't often cross paths with crying children. It was a world of noise, machines, and freedom, not fear and desperation. The boy stumbled closer, clutching his small fists, his eyes wide with panic. The leader of the group, a tall man with a deep scar running over his left eyebrow, stood up slowly. He didn't smile or speak right away. He just looked at the boy, trying to read the truth behind those trembling eyes. "Kid," he said, his voice low but steady. "Slow down. Tell me what happened." The boy tried to speak, but his words tangled in his throat. His voice cracked as he pointed down the road. "A black van. They stopped near our car." My mom screamed. "They pushed her inside and drove off. Please, you have to help her." The bikers exchanged uneasy looks. One of them muttered, "Could be a trap. Could be a setup." Another said, "Cops might be around." But the leader kept his eyes on the boy, seeing past the fear and dirt. There was no lie in that kind of terror. His hands trembled, his knees scraped, and his tiny voice shook with something too real to fake. The leader crouched down, resting one rough hand on the kid's shoulder. "You saw it happen?" he asked quietly. The boy nodded, swallowing hard. The leader stood up again and looked around at his crew. "You boys feel like doing something right for once?" he said, half a smirk tugging at his lips. There was a short silence before one biker rolled his shoulders and grinned. "Hell, why not? Been a while since we chased anything but wind." Another biker kicked his stand back and said, "Count me in, boss." The boy watched them in disbelief, his hope flickering back like a light in the dark. The leader turned to him again. "Which way did they go?" The boy lifted his shaking hand, pointing toward the stretch of empty road disappearing behind the diner. The leader nodded once, then motioned toward one of the bikes. "Hop on," he said firmly. The boy hesitated, glancing at the roaring machines. "Don't worry," the leader added with a faint smile. "We don't bite." The boy climbed up onto the back seat of a bike, holding tightly to the leather jacket in front of him. The rumble of engines filled the air again, deep, thunderous, and alive. Dust rose in swirling clouds as one by one, the bikers kicked their engines to life. The leader adjusted his gloves, pulled down his goggles, and looked back at the boy. "You hang on tight, kid. We're gonna find her," he said, his voice rough but calm. The boy's small arms tightened around the biker's waist as they roared down the road, the wind whipping past them. The diner shrank in the distance, swallowed by the horizon. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, fear still burning inside him, but now, just barely, hope began to beat beside it. He didn't know who these men were or why they'd decided to help, but in that moment, they were his only chance. The leader rode at the front of the pack, his eyes locked on the road ahead, his mind flashing with images he thought he'd buried years ago, a small boy of his own, lost long ago in a world that never gave second chances. Maybe this was his chance to make one thing right. Maybe this time he wouldn't be too late. The rumble of engines grew louder, echoing through the empty highway as the sun dipped lower. At the edge of the desert road, the leader leaned into the wind and muttered under his breath, almost like a promise. "Hang on, kid. We'll find her." And with that, the gang sped off into the fading light, leaving behind nothing but dust, echoes, and the faintest glimmer of hope on the horizon. Engines thundered across the long stretch of highway, shaking the silence of the empty desert road. Heat shimmered off the asphalt as the bikers rode in formation, a blur of leather, chrome, and determination. The little boy sat clutching the waist of the biker in front of him, his knuckles white, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "They went that way," he shouted, pointing toward a far-off line of cracked pavement leading toward the industrial zone. The leader, riding at the front, gave a sharp nod and pressed the mic inside his helmet. His voice came through rough and steady, filled with command. "Split up. North Ridge, East Road, and rail line. Don't lose visual." Instantly, the group scattered like a swarm of thunderous beasts. The sound of screeching tires echoed as they veered into separate lanes, their engines howling in unison. Dust rose behind them, clouding the horizon. The leader's eyes narrowed beneath his goggles, scanning the road ahead for any sign of movement. Every instinct in his body screamed urgency. Time was bleeding away fast. Minutes passed like heartbeats. The boy could barely breathe, holding on as the wind slapped against his tear-streaked face. The biker he rode with turned his head slightly. "Hang in there, kid," he said through the wind. "We're gonna get her back." But the boy said nothing. His eyes were locked on the endless road, searching for that one black van that had stolen everything from him. Suddenly, static crackled through the leader's earpiece. "Boss, I've got something. Black van side road near the quarry," another biker's voice shouted. The leader twisted his throttle and shot forward. "Stay on him," he barked. The chase was on. They flew across the cracked highway, engines roaring like a storm. The black van came into sight. A dented, filthy machine tearing down a narrow road, its tires kicking up gravel. The leader's pulse surged. "That's them," he muttered. He leaned forward and signaled his crew. Two bikers flanked him, closing in from both sides. The van's driver saw them in the mirrors and panicked, jerking the wheel to the right. The van swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road, sending a spray of dirt into the air. "Hold your line," the leader shouted. He veered left, his front tire inches from the van's metal side. Another biker roared up alongside, tapping his helmet in signal. Together, they boxed the van in, forcing it to slow. But the driver was desperate. He slammed the brakes, then suddenly jerked the wheel toward one of the bikers. Metal screamed against metal. The biker barely dodged, his rear tire skidding, sparks flying. "He's trying to ram us!" someone yelled. The leader gritted his teeth. He'd seen men like this before, cowards with power, feeding off fear. But he wasn't backing off. Not today. He accelerated, pushing closer to the van, close enough to see the terrified face of the driver through the cracked window. The boy behind him cried out, "That's them! That's the van!" His voice was filled with both terror and hope. The van took a sharp turn, tires shrieking as it darted off toward a run-down industrial area. Old warehouses loomed in the distance, their broken roofs glinting under the dying sun. The leader motioned to the others with a quick hand gesture. "Cut them off!" he shouted. Instantly, 3 bikers peeled away, taking side routes that curved through the back alleys of the industrial yard. The rest stayed on the van's tail. The chase wound between rusted fences, crumbling concrete walls, and piles of old scrap metal. Every corner was a risk, every second a gamble. The van tried one last desperate move, slamming into a side fence and skidding to a stop near a massive rusted gate. The doors flew open. 3 men jumped out, sweat-soaked and wild-eyed. One of them shouted, pulling a wrench from his belt. Another had a knife glinting in the light. They clearly hadn't expected what faced them next. The bikers rolled in one by one, surrounding the van in a roaring circle. The leader's engine idled low as he took off his helmet and swung his leg over the bike. Dust swirled around him as he stepped forward, boots thudding against the cracked pavement. The kidnappers shouted something, trying to sound threatening, but their voices shook. The leader's eyes were cold and unwavering. He cracked his neck, took another step forward, and said nothing at first. The only sound was the wind and the slow purr of idling engines. One of the kidnappers swung the wrench in warning, but the leader didn't flinch. His crew watched in silence, waiting for his signal. Then, in a voice calm and low but sharp as steel, he spoke. "You picked the wrong family to mess with today." For a moment, no one moved. The kidnappers exchanged nervous looks. Realizing the men they'd just tried to outrun weren't ordinary bikers, they were a storm dressed in leather, and it had already caught up to them. The boy sat frozen on the back of the bike, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. For the first time, he saw not just the fear, but also the power standing on his side. The wind howled across the empty lot as tension filled the air. The leader took another step forward, eyes locked on the men who had stolen a mother from her child. The rest of his crew revved their engines softly, a sound that felt like thunder rolling closer. The boy's heart raced. The kidnappers looked cornered, and fear began to crack their defiance. The leader tilted his head slightly, as if daring them to try something. The moment before the storm had come, and no one was ready for what would happen next. The warehouse stood at the edge of the industrial district, half collapsed and silent except for the wind that moaned through its shattered windows. The black van sat abandoned outside, its doors hanging open. Inside, the smell of oil, rust, and fear filled the air. In the center of the room, the boy's mother sat tied to a metal chair, her wrists raw from struggling against the ropes. The dim light from a broken skylight cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Her heart pounded, but she tried to stay calm. Every sound outside made her flinch, every footstep echoing through the hollow space. She didn't know if anyone would come. Then, faintly at first, she heard it. The low growl of engines cutting through the stillness. The kidnappers froze. One of them, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, cursed under his breath and peeked out through the cracks in the metal door. "They followed us," he hissed. The others grabbed their makeshift weapons, chains, crowbars, anything that could intimidate. They had no idea who they were about to face. Outside, the bikers dismounted quietly, engines dying one by one, until only silence remained. The leader raised a hand, motioning for everyone to spread out. Half of them moved toward the front entrance, creating noise, banging metal, revving an engine to draw attention, while the other half, led by the leader himself, crept along the side wall, where the corrugated metal was peeling open like old paper. The boy, still trembling but determined, pointed toward the side where he'd last seen his mother. The leader nodded once, pressing a finger to his lips. Inside, the kidnappers grew restless. "Who are they?" one demanded, clutching a chain. "Doesn't matter," another sneered. "They won't last long." But before he could finish, the side door burst open with a crash. The first biker charged in, swinging his shoulder into the nearest man. The sound of metal on metal filled the air as chaos erupted. Chains whistled, fists connected with bone, and the floor vibrated under the violence. The leader stormed through the haze of dust, his eyes blazing. He caught one kidnapper's arm mid-swing, twisting it hard until the man screamed and dropped his weapon. Another came at him with a pipe, but the leader ducked, countered with a brutal punch, and sent the man crashing into a wall. The air was thick with the sound of grunts and shouts, boots scraping on concrete. One of the bikers took a hard blow, to the shoulder, but didn't stop. He slammed his attacker into a stack of crates and roared, "You're done!" The boy, hiding behind a pillar, could barely breathe as he watched the fight unfold. Every second felt endless. Then, through the chaos, he spotted his mother, still tied up, eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom!" he screamed, running toward her before anyone could stop him. The leader turned sharply, his focus breaking for a split second as he saw the boy dart across the floor. A kidnapper tried to grab him, but the leader was faster. He tackled the man to the ground and knocked him out cold. The boy reached his mother, sobbing as he tried to pull at the ropes. The leader knelt beside them, pulling a knife from his belt. "Hold still," he said softly, slicing through the bindings with one clean cut. The ropes fell to the floor, and the woman immediately wrapped her arms around her son, holding him so tightly it looked like she'd never let go again. Tears spilled down her face as she whispered, "I thought I'd never see you again." The fight was nearly over. Two of the kidnappers lay unconscious, another groaned on the floor, and the rest were pinned down by the bikers, their faces bloody and defeated. The leader stood up slowly, breathing hard, surveying the scene. His knuckles were bruised, his shirt torn, but there was a strange calm in his eyes. He turned toward the boy and his mother. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low but certain. Outside, the distant wail of sirens began to echo closer, bouncing off the walls of the old district. One of the bikers glanced at the leader. "We should move before they get here," he said. The leader nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, let them take it from here." He looked back at the tied-up kidnappers sprawled across the floor. "Make sure they can't run," he ordered. The bikers bound the men with their own ropes and chains, leaving them in a pile near the van. As the flashing lights of police cars approached, the bikers stepped out into the open, dust and blood streaking their faces. The officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting for everyone to freeze, but the scene in front of them said it all. The kidnappers were subdued, the victims safe, and the so-called gang was already walking toward their bikes. One officer called out, "Wait! Who are you guys?" The leader paused, glancing back just long enough to meet the officer's eyes. There was no pride in his expression, no arrogance, just quiet finality. "No one important," he said simply, pulling on his helmet. The engines came alive again, deep and thunderous, echoing across the empty lot. The little boy stood with his mother clutching her hand, watching them ride away into the setting sun. The police sirens faded behind them as the sound of motorcycles filled the air, a chorus of steel and dust disappearing into the horizon. For the first time in hours, the boy's mother smiled, whispering to her son, "They saved us." And somewhere down that endless road, the leader exhaled, the weight on his chest a little lighter. He didn't need thanks, didn't need a name in the papers. Saving that boy's mother was enough. The road stretched before them again, and with the dying light of day glinting off their bikes, they rode on, silent guardians of a world that would never know their names. The horizon burned orange as the engines faded into the distance, leaving behind only the scent of oil, smoke, and salvation. The boy and his mother stood on the edge of the road, watching the last glimmer of chrome vanish into the sunset. "Foe." Mother clutched her son close, trembling but safe, whispering through her tears. "They saved us." Her voice cracked with both disbelief and gratitude, as if she couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. How a gang of rugged bikers had become their unexpected angels. The boy didn't say anything. He just stared at the empty road, the sound of roaring engines still echoing faintly in his chest like a promise of safety. Miles away, the bikers pulled over near an old roadside diner, their headlights cutting through the dusk. They'd been silent for most of the ride, not because they had nothing to say, but because some moments were too heavy for words. The leader sat apart from the rest, leaning against his Harley, his leather jacket creaking as he pulled an old, worn photograph from his pocket. In it was a little boy, smiling wide, holding up a toy motorcycle. His own son, gone too soon, lost in an accident years ago. The leader's rough hands trembled slightly as he looked at the photo under the fading light. "Guess I did one thing right today," he muttered under his breath. The wind carried his words away, but one of the older bikers nearby heard them. He grinned, calling out, "You getting soft on us, boss?" The others laughed, tossing friendly jabs his way. "Yeah, the old man's got a heart after all." But beneath the teasing, there was respect. They all knew what that rescue had meant, not just to the boy and his mother, but to their leader. For men who lived on the edge, redemption didn't come easy, but tonight it had found them. One of the bikers pulled out a flask, raising it toward the stars. "To the road," he said. "To family," another added. The leader just nodded, quietly whispering, "To second chances." By morning, the town was buzzing with the story. Everyone at the diner talked about the mysterious bikers who had chased down kidnappers and saved a woman and her child. No one knew their names and no one could say where they came from. The cops had arrived too late to thank them. The gang had already disappeared into the night. But word spread fast, as stories like that always do, and soon, the legend of the Guardian Riders became local lore. The next day, when the bikers rolled back through the town to grab breakfast, they found something waiting for them. On their usual corner booth, a small note sat beside a folded napkin. The leader picked it up, and when he opened it, his expression softened. Inside was a child's drawing, a crayon sketch of motorcycles with angel wings flying through the clouds. Underneath, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for saving my mom. You're my heroes." The diner owner, an old friend of theirs, smiled from behind the counter. "Kid dropped that off early this morning," he said. "Said it was for his biker angels." The leader looked at the picture for a long moment, his jaw tightening as emotion flickered across his usually stone-cold face. He tucked the drawing carefully into his jacket pocket, right next to his son's photograph. As the men sat down to eat, the atmosphere was different. There was laughter, sure, and plenty of rough banter, but also a quiet sense of pride none of them could quite explain. They weren't saints. They'd all done things they weren't proud of. But for once, they'd been the kind of men they wished they could always be. The leader took a sip of his coffee, gazed out the diner window at the highway stretching endlessly ahead, and said softly, almost to himself, "Maybe angels do ride Harleys after all." The others chuckled, thinking it was just another one of his quiet jokes. But in his voice there was something deeper, something like peace. Outside, the sun dipped lower, bathing the road in a warm golden glow. The engines rumbled to life again, one by one, the familiar roar echoing through the small town. The leader slipped on his helmet, gave a last nod to the diner owner, and with a low growl of engines, they rode off into the horizon, where the light met the open road. And as they disappeared, their chrome reflecting the last rays of the sun, the world seemed to pause, just long enough to feel the truth of what had happened. They weren't heroes in shining armor. They were men with scars, carrying their own regrets, finding redemption not in words but in action. They didn't seek fame or thanks. They just did what was right when it mattered most, because sometimes the people who look the roughest carry the gentlest souls. Sometimes angels wear leather instead of halos, and compassion hides behind the growl of a Harley engine. And so, the story ends, with the road stretching forward, the engines fading into dusk, and a reminder whispered softly in the wind. Never judge a soul by their cover. Sometimes the ones who look the roughest carry the kindest hearts. True strength isn't measured by power, it's defined by compassion.